All right, so where I think we left off was talking about those first lower southern states seceding, and they are going to elect a pretty moderate government. They write a constitution modeled after the U.S. Constitution. They're going to choose Jefferson Davis to be their president. He was not a secessionist in the beginning, so he was seen as pretty moderate. And as I think I mentioned, the Confederate States of America, the CSA, they were convinced that the northern states would secede too, and eventually everybody would like join the CSA, and we'd be a new, better country, like for all of it. But that's not exactly what happens. Meanwhile, the people in Congress are trying desperately to solve the problem, right? How do we avoid what clearly looks like it might be war? But they are, sadly, without our hero, Henry Clay, and really aren't that good at finding something that everyone will agree with. The best they've got is this Crittenden Compromise. And the Crittenden Compromise was basically going back to the last time we had good politicians, that would be Henry Clay, and says that we should go back to the Missouri Compromise. Let's just pretend that none of this stuff happened. Let's just get rid of the Compromise of 1850. Let's extend that southern border of Missouri, that 3630 line, all the way west to California. Let's get rid of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Let's just go backwards in time and restore this sort of Missouri Compromise in its glory. That was when the country, could all live with itself. And interestingly, there are many Republicans in Congress at the time who, here, I'll write it over here. There are many Republicans in Congress at the time who wouldn't have minded that plan. They were sort of willing to accept the compromise. They didn't want to have a war. But before they really made any sort of official response, they consulted Lincoln. And here's what Lincoln said. Lincoln said, hold on. I campaigned for the presidency promising that we would not expand slavery. Right? He didn't campaign to abolish slavery. That wasn't part of his interest. That wasn't part of the thing he thought he wanted to do. But he had campaigned, the Republican platform in 1860 had been to prevent the expansion of slavery. No more slavery will expand into territories of the United States. And he goes, this compromise will expand slavery. It will create more slave territory that does not already exist. And so Lincoln says, I won't sign it. I won't agree to this compromise. And so then, of course, the Republicans in Congress go, nope, we don't like it. We're not going to go. We're not going to stand by this. And the compromise fails. And really now there's nobody sees any other options besides war. But nobody knows when it will come. Will the North attack the South? Will the South attack the North? What's going to happen? Well, what happens is Fort Sumter. So in April of 1861, just 1 month after Lincoln has been inaugurated, remember that at this point presidents are elected in November but not inaugurated until March. Lincoln has just recently been inaugurated, and there's this question of what to do with Union forts, right? You guys know, Fort Hood, is United States territory. It's federal property, right? If you go and steal a cupcake or something from the commissary on Fort Hood, you could be charged with a federal crime because it's federal territory. So that Texas doesn't own Fort Hood, the U.S. government does. Nod your heads if you get that. Okay, so there are lots of Union forts throughout the South. Well, what do we do with them? They're surrounded by enemy territory that says that they don't recognize this U.S. government. What are we going to do? The South is not really sure what they're going to do either. But in April, Fort Sumter, which happens to be on an island off the coast of South Carolina, had to be South Carolina, right? The crazy ones. Anyway, Fort Sumter's on this island off the coast of South Carolina, and they're running out of supplies, running out of food and medical supplies. They need to be resupplied. So Lincoln has to decide what to do. He could just withdraw the troops, right? Just give up the base. But he feels like that's the wrong move because that sort of symbolizes that he's giving in to the Confederacy, and he doesn't want to do that. In fact, Lincoln maintains that there is no Confederacy. It's kind of like, you could proclaim that you're a unicorn all you want, but you're not actually a unicorn, so you're just saying that, So Lincoln is going to say that, the Southern states say that they have seceded and they're a separate country now, but he's going to argue that there was no legal way for them to do that. The Constitution is not dissolvable by the states. What are the first three words of the Constitution? We the people, right? Not we the states. So while the states say, we ratified this Constitution and therefore we can back out of it, the national government, Lincoln's position is, no, the people created this national government. The states can't get out of it. You're still a part of this country. You can say you're not. You're in rebellion against this country, but you're still a part of this country. I'm still your president. So anyway, so Lincoln says, no, I'm not going to give the territory. So he sends a letter to the governor of South Carolina, and he sends a copy to Jefferson Davis, like, hey, you definitely not president of a separate country. Let me send you some information that you have no reason to need to know. And it says, I'm going to resupply Fort Sumter. I am not reinforcing them. We're not sending weapons or ammunition. This is food and medical supplies only. Love Lincoln, or whatever. So he sends this letter and hopes for the best. But before this Union resupply run can happen, the South Carolina acts first, and their militia attacks the fort. Well, the fort does not have doesn't have ammunition surplus or whatever it is. They can't defend themselves militarily, and so the fort almost immediately surrenders. There's only one casualty. In fact, the Union commander of the fort happens to know the Confederate commander of the South Carolina forces. They were friends at West Point, and so he asked the guy, he sent a message to him, can we just raise the Union flag one more time, then we'll take it down and we'll leave. We'll surrender. And his buddy said, sure, fine, whatever you want. But some of the Confederate soldiers didn't get that message, and so the guy who went out to raise the flag ends up getting shot, which is kind of sad. But anyway, nobody else dies. Fort Sumter falls, right? So the Union surrenders, they leave. But now the South has attacked the North, and Lincoln decides he has to respond. So he begins gathering forces to go back and take Fort Sumter again. And this is our territory. The South Carolinians should not have done this. And it's at this moment then that the Upper South secedes. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They had remained part of the Union this whole time. But at the prospect of going to war against the Southern states, they were unwilling to stay with the Union for that. And so those Upper South states seceded after the Fort Sumter disaster. But I'd like you to point out that even if there was no way to avoid war, Lincoln was pretty savvy in bringing war as it did, because now who was the aggressor? The South was the aggressor. The Union hadn't attacked anybody. The national government hadn't gone after these states. The South openly rebelled, opened fire on the U.S. government, and so we have to use military force to respond. So it was pretty good PR for Lincoln anyway. But so war is declared in 1861. So the Civil War lasts from 1861 to 1865. Those are years you need to know. So the Civil War begins in 1861, and this is what the resource allocation looks like. And I'd like for you to try to restrain yourselves from giggling when you see, for example, that the Union had 32 times as many firearms as did the South, and 20 times as much iron, and 17 times as much available textile productivity. You're going, textiles? Who cares about textiles, Ms. Rodriguez? This is a war, not a fashion show. But uniforms, also bandages, tents, blankets, all of those things that are really crucial to be a successful war effort are textiles. And you might guess that war tends to be a bit harder on textiles than peacetime, so you need even more of them. They need to be replaced more quickly than you would have otherwise expected. So anyway, you can see the value of production, the number of railroad tracks, the factories, and so on. The Union has every possible advantage, not to mention just a simple numerical advantage, right? How many people there are in the North. But in reality, they might look at this and go, how could the South never expected to win? In fact, the South very nearly did win. Can you give me some reasons why? Okay, a couple of things. It's their home territory, which we know, and it's a defensive war, so we know that tends to increase morale, right? You tend to be a little bit more enthusiastic about fighting if you're defending your home territory. There's also the home field advantage business, right? Like the terrain, the best way to maneuver, a quicker way to get somewhere. So there's all of that. And then what does a defensive war mean? How do you win a defensive war? You just don't die, right? You just don't lose. So long as you don't give up, you get to win the defensive war. The only way to lose a defensive war is if the other side completely conquers you, if you no longer fight back. To win an offensive war, right, the Union had to fight an offensive war. To win an offensive war, you can't just win a whole bunch of battles. You have to actually take the territory and control an unfriendly population. It's much harder to do. So all the South needed to win was to just make the North give up, make the North tired of fighting. Whereas the North had a much harder job. What are some other advantages the Southerners had? Sorry? Well, it was a nice city for them, but they'd have far fewer resources than the Union would, urban-wise. A large land mass, there's a lot of places for them to hide, right? You lose a battle here, you have plenty of territory in which to retreat. What else? Okay, they're going to control the Mississippi, which helps them to maintain lines of communication. So they have some, again, geographical advantages. Yeah, Robert E. Lee is far and above superior to any of the commanders the Union put forward, and way better than most of them until Grant. Grant was still not as good as Lee was, but Grant was at least close, right? That's the final Union. The Union goes through 7 different generals over the course of the Civil War, and the first 6 are really bad. And Grant is only good by comparison to them, but he's still not as good as Lee was. And it wasn't just Lee, because many of the lower level commanders in the Confederate Army, Stonewall Jackson is the one you probably have heard the most about, but many of the Confederate leaders are in fact really strong tactically. They have lots of experience from the Mexican-American War, which served them well. Again, the sort of terrain advantage. And then, there's the whole, like, I hate to be stereotypical, but, you've got your Southern country boys and then your Union City boys. Who's going to be better with a gun? And, like, living off the land and stuff, So in reality, even though there were fewer of them, the Confederate forces tended to be more effective, like man for man, than the Union forces. Now the Union had way more people, which is how they ended up winning battles sometimes. But the Confederacy was really good at making do with what they had. So yeah, they had absolutely superior military leadership and so on. So it's really not a foregone conclusion that the North is going to win. And in fact, in 1864, Lincoln faced a strong challenger for the for his re-election campaign. The challenger was this guy named George McClellan, who in fact had been the first general for the Union. McClellan was running as a Democrat in the Union for president, and McClellan's campaign was all about suing for peace. He's basically saying, like, this is dumb. We've lost hundreds of thousands of lives trying to force the South to be part of our country when they don't want to be part of our country. This is like craziness. We need to sue for peace. Let them be by themselves if that's what they want, and like get on with our lives, that we can focus our energies going forward. Well, he almost won. If General Sherman had not arrived in Savannah at the moment that he did to send a telegram to show that Sherman's march had been successful, Lincoln would have almost certainly lost. He was looking very much like he was going to lose in 1864. And if Lincoln had lost, the South would have won, because McClellan would have sued for peace. The South would have been victorious. This would have been the Confederate States of America. So although we can look at this and go, like, clearly the Union was going to win the whole time, it's actually not. It was not a foregone conclusion. There was a lot of trial and tribulation there in the middle. So what is the Union plan? Well, the Union plan is this Anaconda plan, which roughly meant we were going to, like, squeeze the South into defeat. So we were going to try to cut the South in half by taking the Mississippi River, and then we were going to try to cut off the head at Richmond, so take the Confederate capital. By the way, y'all, Richmond is just 1 day's march from Washington, D.C. The capital of the Union, the capital of the Confederacy are really close together. The interesting story of why the Confederacy chose you would think the Confederacy would put their capital, like, in Georgia or somewhere more central, don't you? Wouldn't that make more sense? But one of the arguments was that by putting the capital in Virginia, it kept the state of Virginia more loyal to the Confederacy. And the state of Virginia was really important for the Confederacy because they had the most industrial capacity of any of the southern states. Tredegar Iron Works, for example, is the biggest source of ammunition and cannonry for the Confederacy. So, like, by making Richmond the capital, Virginia was more certain to stay in the Confederacy and not go back to the Union. Anyway, and then the final part of the Anaconda plan was to cut off trade with the outside world, to cut off trade with Europe, Britain in particular. And we know the South had argued for, like, cotton diplomacy or so on. But here's the mistake Lincoln made. Remember, did Lincoln say that the South was a separate country? No, Lincoln maintained the whole time this is merely an internal rebellion, an insurrection, that this is all the United States of America. And if it's just an insurrection, can other countries interfere? No, if it's just an internal problem, other countries can't interfere. There's no, like, right for a foreign country to intervene in your, like judicial system or criminal code or whatever. Like, they can't do that. But you know what Lincoln said as part of the Anaconda plan? He said he was blockading the ports. Who do you blockade? An enemy country, right? A foreign country. If it's your own country, you simply close the port, right? If you have control over a port, if it's yours, you just close the port. We're closing this port to trade. But a blockade is something you do to a foreign country. So it's really one of Lincoln's only big mistakes here. But when he proclaimed this blockade, the British, who, let's face it, were sympathetic to the South, they were culturally similar, and also Britain has not forgotten about the Revolution. They would be sort of pleased to see the country kind of fall apart after all that. Britain looks at the blockade proclamation and they go, aha, a blockade, that must mean the South is a foreign country. If the South is a foreign country, we can claim neutral shipping rights, and we can continue to trade cotton and resources with the South if we want to. So this was sort of a challenge for the Union. Now the problem with the Union is up until the very end, when Ulysses Grant assumes the leadership of the Union Army, the Union does all of these three things, but one at a time. We try to attack Richmond for a while, that doesn't work. Now let's try to attack the Mississippi River. Nope, that didn't work. Now let's try to push in from the western frontier. Nope, that didn't work. They're doing each thing one at a time. What that meant was, even though the Union had far more forces than the Confederacy did, by only pressing one place at a time, the Confederacy could move their forces to meet each challenge. The Confederacy was not well enough equipped to meet all of those challenges at once, but they didn't have to for most of the war. And this is another mistake that the Americans had, or that the Union had. So what's going on in the Union, in the home front? Well, President Lincoln, I'll skip forward a little bit. President Lincoln is a really strong military leader. And one of my favorite quotes from Lincoln is this one. He says, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself to go to pieces, lest that one be violated?" He's talking about his action to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Here's how you spell those words. He chose to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And what that means is, so habeas corpus is this principle that if the government wants to imprison you, they have to, habeas corpus means to bring the body. They have to bring you before the judge and say, we are hereby charging you with this thing. And they have to do that before they can imprison you. Well, although the Constitution clearly says that the government cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus, Lincoln does it anyway. And he puts people in jail without bringing them before a judge, without charging them with any kind of formal crime. He puts them in jail, Confederate sympathizers, suspected spies, secessionists in Maryland and in Tennessee and so on. Like anybody he thinks is a threat to the country, he just puts them in jail without this habeas corpus right, without ever charging them with a crime. And people were very critical of that. They go, Lincoln, like this is unconstitutional. You're breaking a law. And here's Lincoln's response. If I don't break this law, what will happen? If I don't break this law, what will happen? Yeah, but what does this quote say? If we don't break this one law, what's going to happen? Then the government's going to fall apart. The Union will lose. You know, the U.S. government is going to dissolve. We're going to be threatened. We're going to be torn apart from within, and then we won't be able to protect any of your rights. We won't be able to do any of the things the Constitution does. So Lincoln's argument was, yeah, I'm going to violate this law, and I'm going to do it to save the country. Now, we like Lincoln. He ended up with a pretty good legacy. But you can imagine that people at this time were very nervous about this kind of extension of power. But anyway, Lincoln is a very strong wartime leader. He's also going to preside over the institution of the draft very early in the war. This is also controversial. Anytime there's a draft, there's always this sense that the war is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Because there were exceptions. If you were drafted but you didn't want to go, you didn't want to fight, you could pay like $300 or so, which was about a year or two's worth of pay. So you could pay like $300 and then you could exempt yourself. You basically hire a replacement for yourself. So very few of the wealthy are going to be going off to war. And in fact, lots of the conscripts, these young, like drafted individuals, are brand new immigrants, many of them from Ireland, who show up and they're like, they have no attachment to the Union at all, and here they are being told, like, go fight for this country, and they're, have no experience. It's pretty rough. So the draft is picked up early on, and then the Union government itself will institute an income tax as an emergency wartime measure. The Constitution says no income tax, but they institute an income tax anyway as a wartime measure to make sure they had enough money to finance the war effort. And then they began to print greenbacks, paper money, to make sure that the economy can keep running, like the home front economy, because so much of the capital, so much of the hard money is being used to purchase supplies for the war. So, they're buying up all this hard currency or using all this hard currency, and so then like there's not enough for people to like do their daily lives or their daily business. So they print greenbacks. Now it works, the economy continues to function, but what happens when you print paper money? Inflation occurs, right? So inflation is a pretty big problem in the North. Not nearly as big as the problem is in the South, but it's a problem for the North. So there are struggles in the home front as well. In the South, however, the Confederacy has much bigger problems in terms of protecting their home front. First of all, the Confederacy will wait longer to institute a draft. They do eventually have a draft, but it's not until more than a year after the Union institutes their draft, which means that the Confederacy is going to struggle a little bit with having enough soldiers to meet the needs. But even if every single human in the Confederacy had joined the Army, they would have had trouble there anyway. They're also going to face lots of wartime shortages. This is one of my favorite cartoons from the era. And the title is Sowing and Reaping. This appeared in a Union magazine. So this is a Union perspective. And on this side it says, Southern women hounding their men on to rebellion. So telling their men, go fight, represent us, whatever, like kissing them and encouraging them to go off to war. And then here, the reaping side, Southern women feeling the effects of rebellion and creating bread riots. So indeed, throughout the Civil War in the Confederacy, there were bread riots. There were shortages of basically every kind of product you can imagine. I did some graduate research when I was at A&M on the Civil War era, and we were reading letters from women at home on the plantations to their husbands who were fighting in the war. And towards the end of the war, even paper couldn't be found. And so these women, have you ever seen engineering notebooks? They're kind of greenish and they have like really small grid lines, to like have a whole bunch of data. Well, they look kind of like engineering notebooks, but these were ledger books for the plantations. They would like mark each plot of each field and how much did it produce, how much how many pounds of seed did they sow, and how much did it produce, whatever. So all of this would be filled with data. Well, the women would take old, full pages of these ledger books and write in between those already teensy-tiny lines. They'd have their tiny little handwriting, this cursive, in between those lines, because they didn't have any other paper to send. And that's how they'd have to send letters to their husbands. So there are a lot of shortages in the South. And really, Jefferson Davis does a terrible job of responding to that. Davis himself was preoccupied with the military. He didn't understand, I guess, the adage that all wars are won on the home front. And so he kind of ignored like the need for more organization or better like allocation of supplies. And as a result, the home front really suffered. And the people in the South had a terrible time of it during the war. They had not enough to eat, and they were just really experienced a lot of those negative effects. One more sort of thing about the Confederate home front is that they were kind of hobbled by the idea of the Confederacy in general. Like the Confederacy and this idea of states' rights. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like it's really important to have a strong central government if we want to effectively win a war. Right? We can't like ask the states to like make their own choices about who to send or what. The Confederacy, the Articles of Confederation showed that wasn't very effective. So the Confederacy is sort of hurt in its own way by its own ideology. The Southern states each want to have control of their own militias, and there's just not a lot of centralization, which is problematic in the end. So what's going on? Well, by 1862, about a year into the war, here's what's happened. The Union has managed to effectively prosecute the blockade. There are, of course, a few blockade runners like Rhett Butler and Gone with the Wind. You should read the book if you haven't already. It's a really good book. Don't watch the movie, though. It's really terrible. But so there was a few blockade runners, but mostly the Union has been successful at cutting off the bulk of Confederate interaction with the world. Now, the Confederacy had hoped what? They'd hoped that their states would secede, and they had hoped that the British, and maybe the French, would intervene on their behalf, right? Because of... Nobody's listening. Because of what? Right, the Confederacy had hoped. So far, all I've said on that side is that the Union has successfully done the blockade. So if you're writing anything else, we're not ready for that yet. So, so far, the Union has been pretty successful, and the South thought that when Britain felt the pinch of not having enough cotton, that they would intervene on their behalf, right? That was King Cotton diplomacy, nod your heads. King Cotton diplomacy. The problem was, well, a couple of things. The first of which is that 1860, the year before the Civil War, was a bumper crop for cotton. That means there was a whole bunch extra cotton, way more cotton than there normally was. So the British actually had a surplus of cotton in 1861. They had more than they needed from the previous year. So that helped them for a little while. They didn't really need Southern cotton in 1861 and 1862. Then, although cotton was really important for British factories, you want to know what's even more important for Britain? Food. And you want to know who the world's biggest exporter of wheat and corn? The North, the American West, right? The United States was the world's biggest exporter of food products, corn and wheat. So the saying in Washington went that King Wheat and King Corn beat King Cotton, because of course the British can't survive without food. They have to have food to feed their industrial masses. And then finally, those darn British imperialists have recently taken both Egypt and India, which we happen to know are both pretty good at producing cotton. So as the war begins to drag on, and it turns out that we're going to have a hard time getting Confederate cotton, the British are okay with that. They're bringing online other sources of cotton, and so King Cotton doesn't work out for the South as they hoped it would. But anyway, the Union is pretty good. It's pretty effective at the blockade. The next thing that the Union has done is managed to claim or to control most of the American West. So Kentucky and Tennessee have both been claimed by the Union, pacified. Grant does some work here in the West, and he's pretty successful at that. Ulysses S. Grant. He's just a lower-level commander at this point, but we're able to take some of these Western territories. And then we have captured New Orleans, which is important because, of course, that would have been a really great place or a great way for the Confederates to get their cotton out to the rest of the world. You know, the blockade is strongest on the East Coast. That was a great place. Interestingly, after New Orleans is captured, Texas becomes really important for the Confederacy because if you can't get your cotton out by water, by land from Texas to Mexico, right? The Texas-Mexico border was a place where the Union didn't have control. They couldn't blockade us there. And so any cotton that could be gotten into Texas could be shipped through the Mexican border, and they could bring in some capital that way. But anyway, the South has crazy amounts of surplus cotton. They're using it like as reinforcements, ramparts, for them to hide behind in fights. They strap it onto their ships as like armor when they run out of iron to protect their battleships. They put it inside the walls of forts. Anyway, they're using it everywhere because they can't get enough of it out because the blockade is so successful. But I'd like you to pay attention to what the North hasn't done. What the North hasn't done is take Richmond. It's just a 1 day's march from Washington, D.C. How hard can it be? But in fact, because Robert E. Lee is stationed there, and he is a brilliant military tactician, and because Union generals are so afraid of political costs that they don't do what needs to be done. A good example of that, I can tell you about McClellan. He was that first Union general. Very early in the war, McClellan is given a force of troops. He said, go take Richmond. It is not that far away from here. Like, this can't be that hard. Well, he gets there. When he arrives, he has a 4-to-1 advantage. He has 4 times as many soldiers as the Confederates do. But 2 things. First of all, Lee is brilliant and manages to, march his troops over here to parade, and then they quietly move somewhere else. And they march over here and they parade, and they quietly move somewhere else. So McClellan thinks there are more than there are. Lee lights a whole bunch of fires all over the place at night, to make it look like there's more camps than there really are. Anyway, Lee kind of fools him. But also McClellan is just nervous. He doesn't really want to go into battle, and what if people die and they blame him, and what if he looks bad, and he's just a little he just can't. So he waits for reinforcements. And he waits, and he waits, and he waits, and he waits, and he waits for reinforcements. And during this time, as Lee knew, the rains come, and the roads get super muddy. Also, Lee is reinforcing and fortifying his positions so that when McClellan finally decides to attack Richmond, first of all, he's now come from a 4-to-1 advantage to just a 2-to-1 advantage, but he still overpowers them. But he's unsuccessful. He attacks for a while, takes heavy losses, and instead of pushing the attack, if he kept going, he might have been successful because the South was struggling with keeping their supply lines straight. But he takes heavy losses and he just withdraws. And this happens over and over again. So this is sort of demoralizing for the Union, right? Can we not even take this city that is so close to us? And then also, the Union has failed to take the Mississippi River. The Confederates have really fortified the river, and this is allowing them quick transportation among those western Confederate states, which is going to, again, pose problems for the Union because it allows them to sort of divvy up their forces to meet the needs as quickly as it is required. So what's going on diplomatically? Well, we've mentioned before that the British kind of want the Union to win, right? The British kind of want the Confederacy to win. Again, they are culturally similar, right? This hierarchy, this sort of aristocracy or whatever. And then remember, the British would be totally fine to see the United States fail after we embarrassed them in the Revolution, 1781 or whatever. But the British also don't want to get involved in war if they don't have to. And so as 1862 wears on, the Confederacy is demanding, is begging the British, you've got to get involved on our behalf. Well, the British do continue to send non-war supplies, right? Neutral trading rights mean that you can sell, food products or textiles or anything that's not about war. You can sell that. So, the British were kind of like pushing the envelope a little bit. For example, they would sell the South transport ships that just so happened to have iron armor on the outsides and these sort of interesting looking mounts where you just so happen you could just put a gun right there with just a few extra bolts. So they're basically producing warships for the South, just not the guns. So they can say, this is just a trading ship. We're just selling a trading ship to the South. They've heard of the Trent Affair in your book. Anyway, but why doesn't the United States, why doesn't the Union government push it too far? Yeah, we don't want to give the British any reason to get it on the side of the Confederacy. We're doing everything we can to keep the British out of the war. One of the sort of final things that we could do will come at the end of 1862, and that's going to be the Emancipation Proclamation. So Lincoln had been thinking about emancipation for a long time. It was not part of his original campaign. When Lincoln became the President of the United States, he did not want to abolish slavery. He wanted simply to prevent its spread westward. And Lincoln would have even told you, he goes, I don't think the U.S. government can abolish slavery. I don't think it's within our power to do that. The states have a right to choose for themselves what they want to do. So, but as the war goes on, it's becoming pretty clear that slavery is a really big deal. First of all, slaves have sort of pushed this process of themselves. It's not like slaves just wait around for something to happen to them. Slaves these are human beings with their own agency, their own active force in the world. And so as the war goes on, many slaves would, as soon as the Union Army came close to them, would flee. They'd escape from they'd run away from their plantations, they'd run to the Union Army. And these Union generals are going, what do we do with these people? They're slaves, we have to give them back? Because, Confederate or Southern people, Southern men would walk up to the Union camp. Excuse me, you have my slave, I saw them escape into your line, I need you to give them back. And what do? Lincoln wasn't saying that we were going to end slavery. Slavery wasn't illegal. What are you supposed to do? So Lincoln comes up with something called the Confiscation Acts, which I think is just really clever because it uses the South's own logic against him. What does the South say that slaves are? Okay, so in a war, let's say that I'm battling Hannah, and I march through, and we fight over her land, and I defeat Hannah, she runs away, she retreats, and so now I occupy her farm. What can I do with her farm? Whatever I want, right? I can take all of the stuff in her barn, I can, confiscate her horses, I can use anything that she has. I've taken it from her as war, she fought against me. It's my right to take that, take that stuff. Nod your heads, you're with me? So why is that any different for slaves? They're property, aren't they? They're just property. Then as we march through the South, we can just take your slaves. And in fact, slaves in the Confederacy had been used as tools, sort of makes my stomach hurt to say that, as tools of war. They'd been forced to dig trenches and to build up roads and to carry supplies. They were used as a means of war. So the Confiscation Acts had given the Union Army permission to confiscate slaves, not to give them back to the Confederates, to the Southerners, to take them and keep them. And then they were put to work helping the Union Army, and so on. But Lincoln has become convinced over the course of time that he really needs to do more. For example, there are many thousands of brave black soldiers who are fighting on behalf of the Union at great risk to themselves. First of all, they have to fight under really discriminatory conditions. They have only white officers. They're treated like less than other soldiers. Second of all, these black soldiers are taking on really high risk because the Confederates made it clear that any time they encountered black soldiers, so capture them, or if a black regiment were to surrender, that all black soldiers would either be immediately executed, no surrender, no prisoners of war, immediately executed, or sold into slavery. So these free black soldiers are taking on immense risk, right? They're being very brave to fight for the Union, and Lincoln is really impacted by this at a personal level. He also has come to recognize that fighting for a Union isn't exactly like a rousing cause. Maybe you want to go and risk your life for the idea of union, to keep some southern states, or to force southern states back into the country and they don't even want to be in. it's hard to get really excited about that kind of thing. It's hard to have morale. But if you were fighting for freedom, that seems to put like morality on your side. That seems to put a little bit of enthusiasm into your step. It's easier to commit yourself to fighting or risking your life for something like human liberty. So Lincoln is waiting for an opportunity. He's had the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation for a while, but he's waiting for an opportunity to give it because, I hate to tell you this, but the Union is losing a lot of battles all over the place, right? And Lincoln doesn't want this Emancipation Proclamation to look like some last-ditch effort, like some pathetic attempt to whatever. He wants it to look like an act of strength. And so he finally waits. He gets kind of what he's waiting for at Antietam. This is September of 1862. Antietam was the bloodiest single day of fighting the U.S. has ever seen, ever, like in any war to the present day. One day, bloodiest single day of fighting ever. And it was a Union victory, right, with giant quotation marks around that word victory, because we didn't lose. We didn't win anything either, but we didn't lose. This Confederacy was, the Confederate Army was the one that retreated. So we won nothing, like this territory we didn't even need. We won. So Lincoln used that as his excuse to give, or his opportunity to give the Emancipation Proclamation. He gives this speech. And in this speech, what he says is that, this is September 1862, he says that any territory that remains in rebellion against the Union by January 1st, 1863, will have their slaves immediately freed as an act of war. Right? Like, this is going to be his, if you want to protect your slaves, the way to protect your slaves, or to protect slavery, is to give up and join the Union, because that's the only way that you're going to get to keep them. Now, we can giggle a little bit. Are any of those territories in rebellion against the Union listening to Abraham Lincoln? No. So does the Emancipation Proclamation free slaves? Not directly anyway, right? Because the territories the Union did control, like Tennessee and Kentucky and Maryland and West Virginia, the ports on the coastal edge of South Carolina, the area around New Orleans, those areas, they are exempt. They are slaveholding areas, and they will not lose their slaves. Their slaves are not freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. It's literally only supposed to apply to those that are in rebellion against the Union. It's like the carrot and the stick, right? You want to keep your slaves? All right, come back to the Union. If not, we're going to take your slaves away, or whatever. On the other hand, it is inspiring for the Union soldiers. They feel like they're fighting for freedom now. This is a big deal. It inspires many slaves, right? They hear, ooh, the Union is fighting for our freedom. We are now, the word gets around. The Southerners aren't spreading the word, but the word gets around. And so many slaves in the South increase their efforts to, run away from their plantations, or to subvert the Confederate war effort from, wherever they are. They begin to do more of that. And remember what Britain did way back in the 1820s? Abolish slavery. The British were one of the biggest sort of abolitionist countries in the world. They were strongly abolitionist. Can they support a country that is now fighting for slavery as opposed to for independence? No, they can't. So politically now, Britain can't support the Confederacy, even if they maybe would have done it otherwise. This is sort of a genius diplomatic move on Lincoln's part. So, the Emancipation Proclamation is in many ways sort of a turning point in the war. It boosts Union morale. It keeps the British out of it. It changes the nature of the war. We're no longer fighting simply for Union, but for an actual abolition of slavery. It's the first time the United States national government has set itself on this course to promote human equality. Pretty big deal. So again here, about 200,000 African American troops have served in the war. The Confederacy does not use black troops until the very, very end, right? Spring of 1865, and the war ends in April of 1865. So maybe for a couple of months, there are some black soldiers fighting in the Confederate Army. But the Confederates are terrified of the idea of black people with guns, right? They had seen Denmark Vesey's rebellion, Nat Turner's rebellion. They thought that giving guns to their slaves was a horrible idea. But they got really desperate at the end, and they tried it. But anyway, it was already too late for them. But 1863 then is perhaps the next, or is perhaps the most important year of the whole war. Not only is it the year in which the Emancipation Proclamation takes effect, right? Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. It's also the year in which Ulysses Grant will finally be successful at the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the last Confederate outpost on the Mississippi River. You need to know that. Vicksburg was the last Confederate outpost on the Mississippi River. So because the Confederates held Vicksburg, the Union could not use the Mississippi River to transport troops or supplies. We were still, we couldn't take advantage of the fact that we had been successful elsewhere. So Grant basically established a siege of Vicksburg. He can't defeat it. It's really well defended. He can't just, overrun it. But he puts it under siege, and slowly, he's willing to throw troops at it. It's sort of grim calculus, but he goes, I've got more troops that can die than the Confederacy does. Throws troops at it, so Vicksburg falls, and then Gettysburg. We'll pick up there tomorrow.